Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of the Daily Run. As we're playing as Apollyon. With the introduction of updates and DLCs and just booster packs in general, we tend to get a lot more items. And that's something that I would say is generally pretty good, because we get more items to play around with, there are many more synergies. Of course, if those items are subpar or maybe not interesting or just dilute the item pools, it can end up having a feeling that maybe something's not right, and I think that's what a lot of people felt with Afterbirth Plus. Now I think the situation has improved with the addition of booster packs, and the game just feels a little bit more balanced now and just a little bit more fun to play. But I think more than any other character, Apollyon gets the most benefit, because whenever you play as Apollyon, when new items are introduced, you just get an extra layer of decision making on top of what already is there. I think that the Void is actually a pretty complex item, and I do enjoy how it defines Apollyon as a character in some sense. And what it does, whenever you get a new active item, you just get so many different combinations to try out, because now suddenly an item from Booster Pack 5 and maybe an item from Booster Pack 2, which on their own are not very good, might work really well together if you kind of merge them into one active item that's called the Void. And just because of that, I think it's very interesting to discover the new booster packs as you actually play with this character. Now obviously the booster pack 5 is quite old and there won't be any more booster packs in general, but I felt like pointing it out because I think this is like the first time I've actually played as Apollyon since booster pack 5, which is kind of sad, but also I don't really play that game as much as I did anymore, so it's just, I think, something fun to point out. But also the passive items, right? The passive items that get added into the game, especially if they have nuanced effects, and because a lot of community creations aren't just regular stat upgrades, it becomes a much more interesting decision on whether you want to suck it up or not. In this case, I found the Holy Poop, which is a new item, so I wasn't really sure if it's worth sucking up. First, I actually thought it was an active item, so I figured I'm not gonna, why would I even suck it up, right? I can just pick it up and put it back down so I can actually get it out of the item pool. But it turns out it's a passive item, and it's a really bad passive item, because every time you get hit, you leave a poop on the ground, a holy poop on the ground, which has a small aura, and as long as you're in that aura, you get a reduced tear delay. And that can be good, obviously, but it turns out that most of the time it's actually not, because you end up destroying the poop and you just can't do much with it. So it would be the perfect candidate to suck up, because getting a random stat upgrade would be much more useful, I think, in basically any scenario. It just doesn't do much for you. It gives you a 3 tear delay very temporarily, whereas in the fact you could get a -2 tear delay basically forever, and also some damage upgrades. Now with booster packs and just DLCs in general, besides getting new items, we sometimes also get different enemy AI, and what better example of that is than Krampus. This is something I kind of wanted to hype up a bit, but you'll see what I'm saying. Krampus got a lot of new attacks with the DLCs that came to Rebirth when we actually got it. So first he got the spinning attack, then he got the diagonal attacks, then he got the spinning diagonal attacks, and in this one, I think in the Afterbirth Plus, he actually got a new one as well, which I think is pretty rare, but I'll point it out now. So as soon as I'm fighting Krampus here, you'll see that he made a little dash. I slowed it down here for you so you can see how it looks like. I've never seen him do that in all of my 900 hours playing the game. Now, admittedly, this did come in Afterbirth Plus, I think, so it's a relatively recent addition, but I don't remember him actually ever doing that, so that's just ridiculous. It actually caught me off guard very severely. I did get hit because of it. Now, in this particular run, I didn't actually get hit that much, but whenever you get hit by an attack like that, it just feels so silly, I suppose, because it's something that you haven't seen before. It's something that's very hard to account for as well, especially with Krampus. You never really know which attack he's gonna do, but maybe what's really funny is the more attacks he has, the easier it is to avoid it. I remember when he only had the diagonal spinning attack and also the horizontal spinning attack, it would have been very difficult to dodge, because if he did one or the other, then he could either turn clockwise or counterclockwise, so it would be very hard to predict, and you would only have a few pixels of room. Now, I think there was enough time to actually react if you got used to it to a certain point, and if you positioned yourself well. But my problem with attacks like this is that you just have to be in a corner somewhere, and you really can't fight back while that attack is going on, or at least while you're trying to dodge it. So it just feels very passive, and sure, it's the right choice, but it doesn't feel good. And Krampus is just, that's general fight, which I'm never really happy to see. On the first floor, the second floor, he doesn't tend to have too much HP, so at least he's doable, but later on, if you don't have enough DPS, he can actually be a real slug. Now, using some bombs to help him speed up is incredibly useful, and I think bombs in general are just items, or at least consumables, that you find in the game that a lot of people tend to neglect, but they are actually so useful when your DPS is low, especially when you use them on bosses and such. But okay. So that caught me off guard. I did get hit because of it, and seeing a new attack from Krampus is, in some sense, ridiculous, but it also made me realize that how simple AI tends to be in this game. I think it's the main reason why a lot of bosses don't really feel bossy enough. A lot of different enemies only have 2 or 3 attacks, and they tend to be very predictable, especially once you learn them. If you compare this to something like Enter the Gungeon, sure, of course, those enemies have a very predetermined amount of attacks, and there's only 3 bosses per floor, I think, which is obviously much less than the bosses in this game, so it just means they had a lot more room and time to polish those attacks and just make them a little bit more interesting. But there's a very clear progression. As you go to higher floors, enemies become much harder, but in this particular case, that's not usually the case. The only difference I really feel with enemies, or at least with bosses in this game, is the fact that some of them have much more HP than the other ones. Attacks generally don't really feel all that unique. Either they're a spread shot, they're a diagonal shot. I think the Stain is one of the most interesting attack patterns that actually exist in the game, and it does become a little bit rhythmic, and for that reason I tend to enjoy fighting him. Now, if only he didn't have that attack where he disappears under the ground and becomes invincible, I feel like he would be one of my favorite bosses, but he does have that attack, so I really can't say much in that regard. So yeah, bosses in this game tend to feel what I would say a little anticlimactic. Maybe that's the point, maybe they're not really supposed to feel like anything special, but I do tend to find myself just gunning for the boss because I usually end up finding them easier. Now there are some champion variants and some enemies, bosses, which I rather wouldn't face because of how annoying and just how tanky they are, like I said before. But still, overall, in the case, knowing that you can get a Devil Deal and knowing you're going to get an item after finishing them, and relatively to some floors, they can end up actually being easier. So, for example, I think if you go to the Cathedral tends to be a much harder floor than the Isaac boss fight, which is guaranteed at the end. Isaac boss fight, if you get through the first phase, maybe through the second phase, it becomes just trivial. It becomes very easy to deal with him, unless your damage is very, very low. But even in that case, he's not too terribly difficult. Even in the case of something like not the Void, but the Dark Room or the Chest, right? It becomes the same problem. You have these enemies and bosses that are supposed to appear in previous chapters of the game, but they're much harder than Blue Baby is, or I even think the Lamb is. The Lamb was always annoying to me, but that's mostly because I just hadn't fought it much, but once you fight it for a few times, you actually realize it's not that bad of a boss fight, and I actually hate the Double Dash Room much more than I had the Lamb boss fight. It also feels much more unfair, because there are certain combos in the game, not combos, but certain attacks that they can kind of join together to make your life a living hell, and I don't tend to enjoy that. I tend to enjoy my life not being a living hell. I hope that makes sense. But it's just one of those things which I think you realize only after you've played the game for a long amount of time, and whenever an enemy does a new attack that you haven't seen before, it just becomes very apparent, and it just kind of sticks out as this sticking stone, because we're so used to the game at this point. We've played it through so many times, we kind of know what we're doing. A lot of it is just muscle memory. We stand in very particular positions in the room to avoid getting hit, so when something new happens, it tends to throw us off guard. And I also think it just makes us a little bit more excited for the game. I know it made me excited to get hit in that situation, because most often than not, when you get hit in this game, it's just to a situation that's very hard to avoid. Either there were too many bullets in the ground, or just enemies spawning on top of you, telefragging you, or just some cheesy way to take damage. So when an enemy just does something new to surprise you, I suppose, and just deals damage to you outright, that just tends to, I think, be a very exciting feeling in some sense, because it's like, yes, I took damage that was my fault, and it was because I didn't know, and there's something more I can learn about the game. Now, maybe that's my mindset. Maybe a lot of people wouldn't agree, because that attack is so rare, so it's very hard to account for. But still, I tend to enjoy exploring new things or finding out new things in a game that I've played for over 800, maybe even 900 hours at this point. So the run is completing to an end, and I think that in regards to Apollyon runs, this one was very standard. We sucked up a lot of bad passive items, we sucked up some nice active items, mostly the Book of Sin, which I think was pretty useful throughout the run. We got some consumables, we also got money equals power and 99 cents, which is always a good combo because you get something like 4 or 5 damage. So with the addition of sucking up passive items, which gives us tear delays, being at 5 tear delay with 11 damage is not obviously too terribly good. We got no special effects besides spectral tears, but it's still enough DPS just to make me feel safe on taking on the harder bosses in this game. I don't think I would fight Hush with this particular build, so I'm very glad he didn't exist, but just because you really want piercing tears in that fight, because he spawns so many little enemies which have so much HP. But finding something like the Lamb is actually a really interesting one, because the fight doesn't tend to take that long, and you really have to start dodging the attacks he does and just really positioning yourself well in regards to the corpse and the head. I think that's a really interesting dynamic I would once like to explore and maybe talk about. But for now, we did finish in the 19th place, which I think tends to be a pretty good score. I didn't take that much damage until the Dark Room, which is a pretty standard for me. I always hate when I play really well and I only take like 2 hits of damage up until I find the Sacrifice Room, but then I know my damage penalty is gonna be bad anyway, because I have to play the Sacrifice Room to get to the Dark Room, and then of course the Dark Room tends to be pretty hard, usually, or mostly I would say, so it takes some more damage there. But overall, 19th place is relatively good. I'm glad for what it is. I'm glad I came to the end, and I'm glad that I experienced something new to the game that I hadn't seen before. So with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed this one, guys, and I hope to see you next time.